welcome to the Daily Atheist Morning Show. It is Wednesday. It is Wednesday, the 2nd of August, 2020. I am your host, the amazing Super Chris. I'm hoping you're having a great week. It's hump day. We're halfway to the weekend. Normally I do the halfway to the weekend thing, but we got a lot to do today, so I'm going to skip the halfway to the weekend thing. So good morning to everyone. I have got my now new co-host, Andy Hall, from the Laughing in Disbelief blog over at Pathos is joining me. My Wednesday co-host, John Funk from Atheist Incorporated and Reading Incorporated is joining me. I think did I screw that up? I got a lot going on. Anyway, he's joining me again this morning. They'll be joining us in just a second. And we've also got a couple of special guests. Stephen DeMarco from Atheist News is celebrating his 4 years doing the thing at the place for the people. You guys and me are the people. And we've also got Derek Lambert from MythVision. The MythVision channel on YouTube. He is joining us this morning. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But we don't have enough spots for everybody. So I'm going to let Andy drive. Andy's going to drive the show. I'm going to be doing the magic in the background. So I will see you guys at the end of the show right after this. Hello and welcome to Shakespeare with a Redneck. What the? I am Wild Bill Wigglestick, and I'll be your handsome host, your gilded guide, your cowboy concierge of Shakespeare. Dude, really? Today on Shakespeare with a Redneck, I'm going to perform the prologue from Romeo and Juliet. Damn it, Bill. Two households, both alike in dignity in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage, the which if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. Hey, that wasn't half bad. I'm not as dumb as I look. Of course not. You'd be in a coma. Okay, so here's a quick rundown of the situation. Bill, two snot-nosed brats ignore the warnings of their learned parents and end up getting 4 people killed. Bill, come on, man, you're always blah, blah, atheist stuff, blah, blah, boring. Say something fun, for goodness sake. What? Particle is a fun word. Bill, particle, particle, particle. Bill, or talk about horses and dogs. People love horses and dogs. Or boobies. Everybody loves boobies. Bill, oh, can I say boobies on YouTube? If you close your eyes, it doesn't count. Talk about boobies then. Okay, everybody loves those cute little blue-footed bastards. It hurts right here. Culture, baby, coming at you. Avoid bringing a plague on both your houses. A plague on both your houses! By hitting that subscribe button, then that little notification bell. And bang that thumbs up button like frisky cousins at a family reunion. Thank you and take care. Peace. You guys.
Are we live? We are live. John, that's what this means. John, Mr. Funk, how are you today, sir?
I am a little short on sleep, but the coffee is bringing me up. So I'm actually feeling pretty good. And yourself, Andy?
I am doing well. I'm on vacation here in Maine. You can tell by the scenic majesty behind me that there are clouds. Well, I'm actually looking at clouds, and I am begging for decent light. And this is actually considered good light for where I am right now in Maine, which is, of course, in Bahaba, which is one syllable if you're from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, anywhere in the great Northeast.
You know, if I were in Maine, Andy, if I were visiting there, I would visit the home of Stephen King, my favorite writer. I'm just curious if that's of interest to you or not.
It is of interest because I have transformed into a Stephen King character, as you have seen right here, is that I am one of his characters. I have my hat. I have a couple of days scriff on me, my hoodie, a T-shirt. And so, yes, I'm about to go do strange things, maybe drink abnormally early and do all kinds of unsavory activities.
Sounds good.
Before we get to our guest, you know, this is the first time we've had a talk since your debate. Your discussion. Dude, tell me about that. Tell me who it was with and give me like a log line, a couple of sentences.
I I'm assuming you're talking about my debate with Kent Hovind. Is that right?
Indeed.
Yeah, so I debated Kent Hovind. You can check that out on my channel, Atheist Incorporated. And it was an interesting venture. One of my primary goals with that was not to disrespect him. And he did disrespect me, but I thought it went fairly smooth for a Kent Hovind debate. I thought I made some good points, and he made a lot of bad points. And I'm going to be making a video about how everything he said was wrong. So check it out on Atheist Incorporated here on YouTube.
Very good. Very good. I saw part of the debate. I'm looking forward to seeing the clips. And I think it's difficult for when a young guy debates an old guy that you don't fall into some kind of weird paternalistic vibe. You know, I think that's something to fight against.
Yeah, you know, it is kind of strange. He dominated the conversation, so perhaps that was true. It was almost like he was giving me a lecture about how evolution isn't real and the universe can only be 6,000 years old and all this stuff. But yeah, it was kind of weird.
Yeah, indeed. I've heard that we have guests on today. Have you heard that rumor?
Yeah, so what happened is the brilliant, amazing Super Chris booked two guests that were supposed to be on separate days for the same day. So we're going to be talking to Stephen DeMarco about his channel. He's got a good channel here on YouTube, all kind of secular content there. And we're also talking with Derek Lambert, who's kind of like, I don't know, I'd like to call him an expert on the historicity of Jesus as many times as he talked to Dr. Robert Price about the issue. So that's what we've got going on here.
Definitely not an expert.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning things.
I'll give you a lot of credit because Derek's YouTube channel, MythVision, covers this subject in depth. He must have 100 interviews with Dr. Robert Price and David Scarbina and Richard Carrier and all these other people. So, you know, it's definitely the best YouTube channel as far as the historicity of Jesus goes. That's for certain.
Okay. So Stephen, tell me about your channel, Atheist Nexus, or I'm just going to let words fall out of my mouth like syllables. Like tell me about your channel.
Yeah, the channel's Atheist News. I started it 4 years ago, and it was just a simple. I've been on Chris's channel before, on the Daily Atheist before, where I talked in depth about it, but I'll just make a quick summarize of what went on. Was that I was looking for basically a YouTube show that was going to give me the news regarding atheism and religion. And I didn't really find it presented in a news style format. So I just thought, okay, I'll just start it myself then. And that's how it began. And 4 years later, I'm still rolling with new content every weekend. And other than Atheist News, the bi-weekly show, I have tons of other series I produce. It's just a matter of fitting it all in time, you know, between work and family. But there are shows such as Atheist Jeopardy, Science versus Religion. I do a monthly science news show where I just go over all the different news stories related to science from the previous month. And there's, I'm mainly here to talk about my year 4 in review. Now, every year because I started in September of 2016, every September I basically go through the last year's news stories and make a list of the top 10 weirdest stories, top 10 positive stories, top 10 worst stories, and I'll roll that out over the course of a little over a week. And yeah, that's what I'm doing.
So do you have difficulty when trying to classify the worst story from the most popular story? Because sometimes I imagine on the Venn diagram
Now what I do is on the worst stories, I immediately disqualify any stories that involve sexual abuse or death, because those two are so awful. You never want to rank or quantify, you know, this rape was worse than this death, or, you know, vice versa. So the worst stories are not including those two criteria. And other than that, like I said, I just go through all the news stories from the past year, and then I write it down if I think it's a positive story, a really awful story, or a really weird story, and then just go through and rank them and assemble the clips. Interesting.
You also do a show about gods?
Yes, it's called Godsmacked, and it's basically just choosing pretty much any random god from any random religion throughout history that I think is really interesting. A lot of people don't know about. I've done episodes on gods such as Ishtar, who was a Mesopotamian goddess of war and was actually their most popular god. And a lot of people don't associate a war god with a female, you know. So I thought that was really interesting. And I've done episodes on, let's see, Camazotz is one of the more popular ones I've done. He was the Mayan god of death, and he basically resembled a giant bat. And I've done so many now. It's hard to really, you know.
Sure. So what's the connection between Ishtar and Isis? Is there a connection? Because I know
Isis is the Egyptian goddess. So it's separate mythologies. However, Isis was probably influenced by a character like Ishtar. Now, there was a popular meme going around a few years ago where people thought that Ishtar, who was a goddess of war, was also a goddess of fertility and sex. So people thought, oh, maybe that's where Easter comes from. It's actually not. It's a misconception. Easter came from a Germanic goddess called Eoster. So I had to clear that up in the video too, because, you know, as an atheist, you want to look at something and be like, oh, there's more proof that, you know, this is all nonsense. But you want to make sure you get your facts straight, because that only opens up the opportunity for people to poke holes in what you're saying. So you get facts straight. Easter is actually based on a Germanic goddess, Eoster, not Ishtar. Another recent one I did on Godsmack was Moloch.
Moloch, yeah.
Well, what's funny is the reason I found that really interesting is because that's a god in Christianity. That's not a god from the Canaanites or Phoenicians, because archaeologists have never found anything regarding Moloch anywhere outside of the Christian Bible. Moloch does not exist in other religions. Moloch only exists in Christianity, assigned to other religions who never worshipped any god named Moloch. So that was really interesting to me, that Christianity created this god, assigned it to these people who never actually worshipped anything like that.
Was Moloch mentioned around King Solomon's time? Am I pulling this right out of my long-term memory?
Moloch only comes from Christianity.
Interesting.
You know, his channel looks pretty fascinating, Andy. I'm going through it, and he actually set up like he's a real news reporter with like the background, like he's on TV and everything. So I don't know how I've gone this far without finding this channel. And he's got science news, and the Atheist Jeopardy thing looks pretty cool, where he's got 4 people playing Jeopardy. The Atheist Hall of Fame class of 2019. So I'm really impressed by this.
Hall of Fame is another series I do. I do it 4 times a year, every quarter, so that I'm not like log jamming a ton of people into an Atheist Hall of Fame. It's just an excuse to go, like, I get up dressed up in a tux and do like a Hall of Fame ceremony where I explain why these people were important to atheism or why they were important against religion. So like last year, I inducted Monty Python,
nice.
You wouldn't expect, into the Atheist Hall of Fame, because if you think about it, their comedy started in the 60s and 70s. They attacked religion mercilessly.
Yeah.
They made it okay for people, even back then, to laugh at religion. And those kind of seeds in the culture really helped us get to where we are today. So I really celebrated Monty Python for their bravery to really go after these religions. And I interspersed clips throughout the ceremony to show that it wasn't just their comedy. It was in interviews they did on talk shows where they 2 of them actually sat down with an Anglican bishop and a representative from the Catholic Church talking about Life of Brian that was coming out and how controversial Life of Brian was. And they were like, is it any more controversial than things actually happening in the world, you know?
Yeah.
So
for those of you who aren't aware of this, Life of Brian, the great Monty Python movie, was banned in many places due to its religious content.
It was.
Wouldn't
And
shock me.
but the last people I inducted into the Atheist Hall of Fame is all the women protesters in Iran who have been imprisoned and attacked for just trying to live their lives without a hijab. And I really wanted to celebrate their bravery and what they've done. There's like comedy entries, there's serious entries, it's just I inducted Spotlight team a couple years ago.
Oh, Spotlight, right.
I mean,
excellent.
It really ranges all over the world and throughout history, so.
What's the Atheist Adventure Germany thing about?
Basically, Atheist Adventure is a series where I profiled the religious history of a country and where they stand on atheism and religion. So all the Atheist Adventures will just be about a specific country. And the episode I did on Germany really focused in their early days. People don't realize the Norse gods, Thor, Odin, Loki, they're called Germanic gods for a reason. They didn't originate in Norway and Sweden and all that. They originated in Germany, and they migrated that way. And of course, I had to spend time talking about, Nazi Germany and all that. So it really goes throughout their prehistory, modern history, and where they're at now.
Martin Luther hated Jews. Did you talk about that?
I did spend some time on Martin Luther, but it was basically about why he started the church.
Sure. There's so much to cover with Martin Luther. And
some countries are so rich, it takes forever to go through it all. I think my longest episodes were an episode on India and an episode on Egypt, because there is so much to cover.
I don't even know how you would wrap your mind around the history of India.
Well, India is interesting, their history of religion, because they have religions that are atheist. Buddhism is an atheist religion. Jainism is an atheist religion. So it was complex to start where early humans migrated into the area and how the Rig Veda followed them to India. Because before Hinduism, there was animalistic religions happening where they found like altars with like little fox figurines or something, and they don't really know the history before the modern Indians settled the area.
Mm-hmm. When I talk to people about especially other atheists, about the Satanic Temple, and I hear once in a while that it's an atheistic religion, you can't have atheistic religions, I go, hold on there is a history of atheistic religions. And
the Satanic Temple at the end of last year inducted into the Atheist Hall of Fame for all the work they've done. So I mean, for an organization to start just within the past 10 years to become as big as they are and to really espouse a lot more morality than other religions, I felt like they deserved an honor in the Atheist Hall of Fame.
This is really interesting on your site, and I can tell that you've put a lot of time and effort into this content, just skimming through it, but you've got one, Science versus Religion, the Great Flood. So that's really neat that you've got like all these different things going on with great information. I can't believe that I haven't found this already, that there's a secular program that's like a news program. I'm like fortunate about this. I'm happy about it.
The first 3.5 years of my channel, I was very much insular. I produce my content. I write, film, edit, post, and I didn't really talk with a whole lot of people in the atheist community because I didn't need to. I didn't really. My channel is very singular, I guess you could say. So when I started making Atheist Jeopardy, where I had people come on, basically that's when I was like bringing out the olive branch to meet people, because if you want to help get the word out about your channel, you have to socialize. I mean, there's no way about it.
Yeah. So,
and of course, everyone I've met has been really awesome. I've had Hemant Mehta on an Atheist Jeopardy. I've had, Chris was on one. Godless Engineer was the guest with Chris that day. Prophet Azad.
Wow.
X-Cult Baby and Bionic Dance and like Neil 604 Atheist has so far been my only 2-time guest. But
how did Hemant do? Because he was on Jeopardy also.
I mean, he killed it.
He killed it. Yeah, as expected. So, in your opinion, what was the news story most underreported? The story that people didn't hear about in the atheist community that we should have heard about over the last year?
That's putting me on the spot because I do about 20 some stories every show. So we're talking probably over 400 stories I have to think about right now.
Sure.
So probably the most underrated, underreported story to me, going back to my recent Hall of Fame, was Saba Kordafshari in Iran. She got sentenced to 15 years in prison just for not wearing a hijab. And I don't think, because news is hard to come out of Iran, I don't think they get enough press about the things that they go through just to have the freedom to not wear a hijab. And
I'm curious, when you said earlier that like there's a movement with women there that you put in your Atheist Hall of Fame. What exactly like is going on with that? Because
I guess you could say, I mean, I started with somebody in the 90s who she actually burned herself alive protesting it. And but the modern, most recent movement started with Masih Alinejad and her White Wednesday movement, where she actually had to flee Iran. And she lives in England now. But basically she said, I'm starting a Facebook page, White Wednesdays, and if you support the freedom to not wear a hijab, all you have to do is send me your pictures and I'll post it on Facebook of you not wearing a hijab. Or if you still choose to wear a hijab, but you support the right to not wear a hijab, just wear a white hijab and to show your support. And that's where it really all began. And then there's probably a famous image of a woman holding her hijab in the middle of a busy street on a flag, and she's waving it. And that was the next catalyst for in-person protesters in Iran to try and then Iran like enacted their secret police to start abducting these people, and that's why I feel it's hard to get awareness, because Iran is so quick to arrest these people and put them in detention. And for news to make it out of Iran is also really difficult.
I talked to a Iranian atheist. Of course, he lives in the closet in Iran. And I've chatted with him a couple of times. He's a blogger on Pathos. Great guy, Keva. And Iran is not a monolithic society. There are a lot of people here in the West, or a lot here, at least in the States, would think that they are just all in one opinion about hating the West, hating America, for example, the United States. But there isn't. There's a lot of internal conversation about where the country should be going and about the religious rulers there.
Oh, yeah. And I talked about how before the 80s, they were fully embracing Western society. It looked completely different than what it does today. So there are plenty of people who remember what it's like in now a country that's going the opposite direction right now. I covered Atheist Adventure Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And Azerbaijan is an interesting country in that it's about 99% Muslim. However, only about 50% consider religion to be important in their lives. So it's the least religious Muslim country in the world that has a full equal rights for women built into their society. There's a statue of a woman in their capital city tearing off her hijab, and the person who made the statue compared it to an eagle tearing off a net for her freedom. So for a Muslim country to make it so important to them that women are treated as equals is really unique in this world. So, and the reason why it's kind of moving in the opposite direction is because one of the reasons why they're like the way they are is because Azerbaijan had a right to vote for women before the United States did in the early 1900s. Before women had the right to vote in the US, they had a right to vote in Azerbaijan. So it was built into their society, and then the Soviet Union came and took over. So Soviet Union took their opposition to unequal rights, I guess you could say, and really built upon it. Now it's starting to go the other way. Now that Soviet Union broke up in 1990, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
They basically took their original constitution from the early 1900s and restarted it But now Muslims are starting to get, the younger generation of Muslims are starting to become more religious than the older generation that lived in the era of the Soviet Union. So so it's like a flip side to the rest of the world, where younger generations are becoming less religious. In Azerbaijan, the younger generation are becoming more religious.
Right. We should not fool ourselves as atheists, just assuming that the arc of history is always going to go in our favor.
Right.
Turkey is another example of this, a secular country that is growing more and more worryingly. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word. Religious. They're becoming more religious.
That's the authority, though. The younger generation of Turkish citizens are becoming less religious. It's the people in power in Turkey that are creating all these restrictions. I do a top 10 positive stories, and one of the positive stories I did throughout this past year, it didn't make the list, but it made my top 5 winners lists in a different video, where in Turkey, you have to identify what religion you are on your government ID. They made, in the past year, they made it available for people to change that online. So instead of having to go in person to the government building, and this was before the coronavirus pandemic, so they were making this change not because people didn't want to go out as much. They made this change because people didn't want to go in person to change their religious affiliation from Muslim to unaffiliated because of the social stigma. Sure. So now people can do it online and not get that social stigma.
So go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Funk.
No, I was just going to comment again how impressed I am with his channel. You know, I've scrolled back toward like the beginning when you first started.
Go watch those early videos.
Well, what I'm getting at here is like as I scroll up, I can see that you've grown and the content's become more sophisticated. And I'm assuming
I had no idea what I was doing at the beginning.
Yeah, that sounds like my channel. But you know, he's got science news, atheist news. He's got programs on history. He's got these different segments where religion and science conflict, and he goes through the subject, like the flood and evolution and everything. And he's got the Jeopardy and all this stuff, history programs and all this. And he's like consistent with the content. I can see like every day or two at most, you've got something else that's coming out. So yeah, you know, I'm happy that I found this.
Thank you. Yeah, and anytime you want to check it out, just look at the playlists if you want to see all the different series I've made.
You know, let's pivot for a minute. And because I feel we put baby in a corner, and no one puts baby in a corner. Mr. Derek Lambert of MythVision, how are you today, sir?
Good, brother. Good. Doing good.
Good. Tell us about your channel.
First of all, I want to say I really enjoyed what you just mentioned there and the freedoms that we have in many ways. I'm much appreciative of these things, the right to be able to believe, to think about things. I mean, gosh, can you imagine? It's just crazy that, you know, we're born in the time in which we can look at these things and go, hey, I can think how I want to think. And I can also vocalize what I think, which is amazing because I know 300-400 years ago, I'm not sure how long us four gentlemen would stay alive if they knew what we think. My show, MythVision Podcast, it started out called The Water Boys. And we just kind of had a philosophical Bruce Lee attribute to it where we're like, be like water, you know, water enters the cup, become the cup, water enters the bowl, become the bowl. And the whole point was to try and figure out what's going on. You know, I was a very hardcore fundamentalist Christian. And when I say hardcore, I mean, I was studying the Puritans. I was a Presbyterian PCA Reformed Calvinist who grew his Calvinistic beard out. I have old YouTube videos of me preaching salvation is for the elect, the chosen remnant of God, and, you know, from the Bible all day long. You know, I was just a hardcore Kool-Aid drinking Christian. And my studying and being critical of the very things I was looking at is what led me out of the very book in which I held sacred and thought was inerrant, infallible, no contradictions, the whole 9 yards. And so I started to deconvert, if you will, deconstruct, and I began to question things that I once held sacred. And as I did, one of those questions came up, which is a big question I've had early on my channel, which is still a big question. And the channel's growing. It's not just about the historicity of Jesus, but did my God Jesus Christ, because remember now the triune Trinity, etc. That was my held conception at that time. Did he even exist at all? And of course, when you toss that around, anyone can run to consensus and say fringe. It's absurd to even doubt that. I mean, look, even Bart Ehrman, Dr. Ehrman, top prominent scholars will tell you, like, dude, this is not to be doubted. There was a guy, he existed, he had a following, he died. Some had some cognitive dissonance post-mortem experience, and therefore they mythologized this guy. And, the grandma and sister and brother said, I saw him. And then everybody created these mythologies out of it. And it's all a natural. Look, this is not absurd, by the way. His position is not absurd. It's plausible. I'm not joking on historicity at all. I'd be an idiot to sit here and act like historicity doesn't make sense. Of course it does. However, I've found with my channel how you approach the topic, how you look, your methodology when looking into this character will cause your conclusions to be different. And if you take into consideration some of these things, you can actually start to say, well, mythicism's not that absurd. It really isn't. There are people who did not exist, or gods that did not exist, that were worshipped and followed. And so I've been bringing these scholars like Dr. Carrier, Richard Carrier, Dr. Robert M. Price, even some that aren't PhDs like David Fitzgerald, which I'm sure we can get into some of the books that are discussed on these things, but it's a hot topic. Did this guy even exist? Because at the end of the day, Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Carrier and Dr. Price follow the same conclusion. They're atheist. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in Jesus. They don't believe in these things. But one thinks the evidence points in the direction that Jesus actually was not an actual man on earth. There's too much mythology, if you will. There's not enough bone or meat on the bone, if you will.
So anyway. John and Stephen, where are you guys on the mythicist question?
Well, I'll go first. I don't believe he ever existed. And I think there's too much evidence of perspective to support the fact that he didn't exist because of how malleable the story is. And in our last episode of Atheist Jeopardy, we had a category that was just on Jesus. And one interesting thing is that if you look at it from another religion that also believes Jesus existed is Islam. However, they took their own artistic licenses to what happened in terms of they don't believe Jesus was ever crucified. They believe that God changed the face of someone else to look like Jesus, and that person was crucified. It says that in their holy book, in the Quran. And a lot of Muslims believe that Judas was the person who was substituted for Jesus, crucified as punishment for betraying Jesus. So that's another thing to think about when it comes to the historicity of Jesus, is the story's been changed so much that it's likely all artistic license based on somebody who didn't really exist. Whereas if you look at somebody else in history who did exist, there's not a whole lot of conflicting stories about Julius Caesar and the things he did and what happened in his life, or Napoleon. Things happened or they didn't happen. You don't get conflicting stories for the most part when you look at evidence, when you look at archaeology, when you look at the facts. If you just look at the stories, then you're going to have problems. A lot of historians are starting to think that Homer never existed. Yeah. The Greek writer who supposedly wrote works like the Iliad or the Odyssey, those stories were actually told for hundreds of years. And who's their author? Oh, people just started saying it was a guy named Homer. However, there was no actual evidence of somebody existing.
Yeah, when it comes to history, like you said, we'll generally get the same report. Of course, there are influences that come in, political and religious and whatnot. But one thing that you see about the Gospels is that the authors take these great liberties to change the story and dramatize the story, the original Mark, if that is the case. But you don't see that so much in history, where someone's striving to get the story right. It really is kind of a point to historicity or non-historicity, the fact that there's so much going on that couldn't possibly have happened. But I think that it makes a kind of intuitive sense that there was a man named Jesus that was at the beginning, because we have this massive phenomenon now here on earth where there are over 2 billion Christians. So it just seems to make sense that there must have been something there at the beginning. But when you read into historicity there, it really is plausible, I think, that there wasn't a person, because as counterintuitive as it is, historicizing a mythical person is a natural phenomenon that happens all the time. So, it's not unusual. If I were a betting man, I'm not sure which way I would go with it. How about you, Andy?
I'm agnostic about this. I have seen a couple of debates between Mr. Price and Mr. Herman, and I am agnostic about it at this point. But in true skeptic fashion, I am willing to have my opinion changed. Derek Lambert, how would you change my opinion?
Well, look, I'm agnostic as well. I have rightful reasons to be. I think it's extremely important not to be dogmatic on this topic, even if you say, well, I'm a mythicist or I'm a historicist. I don't think you should be dogmatic. This is like trying to say, I know for a fact a certain person exists with no absolute evidence. All you have is a bunch of books that are mythology, and they are myths. So like the thumbnail is a great thumbnail for the show, because Jesus, myth or man? Well, I obviously is myth. Even historicists say he's myth. Yeah. But what do you mean by myth? And so when you say, is he a man who is mythologized? Okay, it's a different story. If you were to like pin me down and put a gun to my head and say, you have to pick, like, you don't have a choice. You have to pick one. Which one are you leaning? I'm leaning total mythology. The reason why, and there's so, like I said, with perception, right? It's easy to start with the idea that historicists will claim is like, look, there's a basis to this. He was mythologized, like a Julius Caesar who's mythologized to a god, or a variety of other god men who were real historical figures, and they're mythologized. However, it's not talked about a lot that people became euhemerized. They had become historicized, so to speak, but they didn't actually exist. And Dr. Carrier, David Fitzgerald, and Dr. Price are known to talk about these things. So if you told me I'd lean mythology, and there's this study called mimetic criticism, or mimesis, and it's this idea, just one example of an idea, is that Jesus is mostly created and constructed from Old Testament literary devices. So it's not even like this New Testament is new material. Like, there might be new places, people, things like that are used into the narrative. And remember now, all of these scholars that even believe Jesus existed agree that the 4 gospels that are in the canon, including Acts, are historical fiction. There might be real people, there might be real places, there might be real things that are talked about, but it's fictional. It's written in a fictional setting. And a lot of the mimesis that I talk about, borrowed from the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, if you're a Jew, you can look at, there's a Dr. Dennis MacDonald wrote a book, and it's called Mythologizing Jesus. Historicist, but he's debated Dr. Carrier on these things as well. But in his book, he makes a case to show that the Gospels are literary reconstructions of the Odyssey and the Iliad. And when you look at the Odyssey and the Iliad, like, Jesus constantly heals a person, says, shh, don't tell him that I did this. It's not my time yet. That's Odysseus. Odysseus comes, he starts revealing himself as a beggar. He's hidden. He doesn't want anyone to know. And there's a moment, I believe it's in Matthew or Luke, where the woman who comes in with all these sins, and the Pharisees are watching Jesus, and she washes his feet with this fragrant oil, expensive oil. And they start to say in their hearts or in their minds, as Jesus can know what they're thinking, if he knew what woman this was, that this woman just came from a strip club, what's he thinking? He's like, this woman's preparing my burial. And he says, wherever my gospel goes, this woman will be spoken of far and wide. Well, the term in Greek for far and wide is the name of the woman who gave Odysseus suckle in the Odyssey. So like there's such an interesting connection here that it shows it's a story. So when you start like picking that apart, I always tell people, like, I'd be more convinced of historicity if there was more meat on the bone. So you have to go to Paul, and you go to Paul and you go, well, what did Jesus do according to Paul? Well, he died and he rose again. He might have had a Last Supper, maybe. Those are disputed. And he might have had a brother, maybe. Very disputable what that means, brother of the Lord.
I think we should not bury the lead on this. For those of us in the chat or people who are watching and listening, that Paul never met Jesus.
Right.
I have 3 things to add real quick.
Please.
Jesus was referred to as the Son of God. Back then, if you were a follower of a certain God, you were known as sons of that God. So for Jesus, if he did exist, probably wasn't probably considered to be an actual biological son of their God. He was a follower of their God. And that if you ever watch Game of Thrones, they have Sons of the Harpy in one of their seasons because the Harpy was the god they worshipped. So they were known as the Sons of the Harpy. 2, I know you guys consider yourselves agnostics towards the historicity of Jesus. I consider myself an atheist only because burden of proof. I'm an atheist for the same reason when it comes to gods and goddesses, because unless there's evidence to prove to me otherwise, I'm not going to believe it. And I mean like real evidence, not stories. So I have the same approach towards the historicity of Jesus. If there's evidence, my mind can be changed. I have yet to see any real evidence.
There's not any.
I understand taking the agnostic approach to it. It's just for me personally, I'm not the same way. And the last thing I want to touch on is the architecture of the Catholic Church. You know, the first major church to really bring about Christianity. A lot of it was borrowed. I did a Godsmacked episode on a god called Dagon from Mesopotamia. Dagon was their sea god. If you look at Catholic imagery, the Jesus fish is actually taken from Babylonian religions. The mitre they wear, the big hat that you see them wearing in Catholicism, is taken from Babylonian priests who worship Dagon. They didn't want to have the same image that other religions have, which is the yarmulke, the turban, and all that. I think it was just the turban back then for Jewish people. So they were like, we don't want to look like them. We want to be distinct. Let's just take this hat from Dagon. And if you look at it from the side, the mitre is actually an open-mouthed fish. That's what it is. So,
how weird. You know, I think this is the most important thing that I've learned today is that the Catholic Church's hats are based on some H.P. Lovecraft deity. Big on the hat.
Dagon, H.P. Lovecraft, who was an atheist, he kind of took the Dagon mythology and spun it into his own thing. Dagon was nothing like the Lovecraftian Dagon.
I want to thank, what was it here? Dragons in Genesis actually made a contribution to the program. So thanks for that. You know, something that's really interesting, and I'm curious here, Derek, what you think about this, because, you know, we all recognize that maybe Jesus was there, maybe he wasn't. Some would say that certainly he wasn't, but that doesn't really tell us what exactly did happen. Of course, Dr. Carrier thinks that Jesus was the celestial being going back and forth and everything. And Dr. Scarbina thinks that it was something else, that Paul just lied about a man that really did exist, that was just a human. What do you, if mythicism is right and Jesus didn't exist, what do you think most likely is the answer behind that?
Okay. Goodness gracious. These are great questions. And I'm glad you're asking me not to like give you guys the answer. Cause that's what I meant at the beginning. When I say I'm not an expert, I'm not here with what I say from the Vatican's lips. And this is the truth. And I am open-minded to this question. This is something that needs to be investigated. The reason I remain agnostic, touching on that before I answer your question, is there are ways of viewing this evidence that can lean, depending on how you view these things, as support, as the possibility that there was a guy. That's all.
Sorry, I want to just jump in on what you're saying in terms of the reason why I don't judge the agnostic view is because there are historical demonstrations of somebody being based on a real person and being embellished quite a bit. And that the perfect example is Dracula, based on Vladislav Tepes, who was a real person, who was a real horrible person. They took that story and created Dracula with it. So it's certainly possible that there was a real guy around that time who was doing preaching, peace and love and all that. However, one thing to remember is that the Greek gods and goddesses and all of those local religions, they were kind of dying out at the time. A lot of religions were popping up. The reason why a lot of people think Christianity did so well is because they celebrated the poor. And there was a lot of poor people back then. So they kind of latched onto this idea of peace and love. They were tired of war. They were very poor. So that could have
Frederick Nietzsche talks about that a lot. And so, you're absolutely right. But to answer your question real quick, let me ask you, are you saying if I were to say a version of Jesus of mythicism, like he didn't exist, what would be the best explanation that I've heard so far?
Yeah.
It would definitely be the celestial concept. It would be some form of an angelic, heavenly being. From what I can understand and grab a hold of here, Dragons in Genesis, who just donated to the show, by the way, make sure you guys go subscribe to his channel. This guy's awesome. He has a podcast where he talks about these things. He talks about Enoch. Now, what the heck is Enoch, right? Enoch has nothing to do with the canon, at least maybe the Ethiopian canon, but not the canon we talk about. So it's like, well, what the heck? Well, this over and over gives these like weird gestures to Melchizedek, these strange priest type figures in the Bible that's very mythological in nature, that Jesus is kind of like a Michael Archangel, so to speak, who comes to battle. But scholars like Margaret Barker, who are believers, but they're extremely liberal and they're willing to go in places most believers would never even venture, says that Jesus himself was Yahweh and that Yahweh had a dad named El Elyon. So he says no one has seen the Father except for me. Well, I thought that there were places in the Old Testament where someone went face to face with God, even though Moses saw God's ass at one point. This is no joke. He literally was like,
it was two different gods in proto Judaism, I guess you could say. There was Yahweh and there was Elohim. That's why the Christian Bible refers to him as both Yahweh sometimes and as Elohim sometimes. It's because it was actually two different gods that kind of synchronized into one. Yeah. That's why there's at times the Christian God is like a person strolling through the Garden of Eden, and other times he's like this omniscient being, formless. It's because it's actually two different gods that were kind of merged into one in Christianity.
Or like El Shaddai is what the God of the Hebrew Bible was called until Moses comes on. Oh, I did not let them know my name as Yahweh yet. It was El Shaddai, but now they know my name.
That's because El was the God, spelled E-L. El was a desert god from Egypt, and when they migrated to the Israel area, that's why you have Israel. Is as in Isis, Ra as in the Egyptian sun god, and El, the desert god of the Egyptians, is Ra-El.
Yeah, I've actually, I need to check on that one. I used to say that a lot, and then a lot of scholars were like, hold your horses on that one particularly. So I'm careful about using that kind of statement because I know a lot of fringe mythicist movements, for example, that are out there, and you'd be shocked. There are different versions of mythicism out there. Sure. And a lot of times the scholarly ones like Dr. Carrier and Dr. Robert and Price will say, hey, don't go there, stick here. Now, I still go everywhere. I don't care because I'm not held down by any dogmas or there's nothing restricting me from investigating these things. The best version of mythicism, angelic form of some sort, it would make sense that they had a heavenly being. You start seeing strange stuff in Daniel. I mean, it's obvious they have a strange type of angelology and their concepts of heavenly structures and whatnot. There are layers to heaven. Paul says, I visited the third heaven. So there's more. You can't look at the canon alone to really understand how this would make sense. You have to go beyond your 66 book protected Protestant Bible to really kind of see some of this stuff and go, wow. As far as historicism, when it comes to historical Jesus, I'm more convinced if there was a guy, he was a rebel. And the reason I would go there, just short, sweet, and simple, would be he's compared to other movements in the book of Acts as these movements did not survive, that were saying, oh, come out to the wilderness. God's going to come and help us, and we're going to defeat the Romans. Judas the Galilean didn't succeed, even though he had followers afterwards. He's compared to Theodus. He's compared to different people in Acts that had these movements that were extinguished. They went extinct, and his survived. There's strange inferences in the Gospels. This doesn't prove historicity. It can be used that way, but it could simply be borrowed from Josephus. I mean, the 3 men on the cross and one survives, Jesus. In the autobiography of Josephus, he talks about how he's traveling back home to Rome. He bumps into 3 of his buddies that are being crucified. He goes and cries to Titus and says, look, my buddies, can we get them down? Those are my friends. They go to get him down, and 2 of them die and 1 of them lives. This is in Josephus. Mm-hmm. We know the Gospels borrow from Josephus the woe saying Jesus ben Ananias that was written in Antiquity of the Jews, I believe, or Wars of the Jews. Maybe it was Wars of the Jews. He's like, woe to you, Jerusalem, woe to you, blah, 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 blah. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Jesus does the same thing in Mark and the Synoptics. So it's literary borrowings from historical accounts, which is why I think historicity tries to say there's some basis here. You borrow from a history book or someone who's quoting history and put it into a fiction, and you might say there's some meat on the bone. But if you find out that it's borrowed, or if it is borrowed, how is that meat? I mean, at the very least, you have what's called histomythicism. All it is it's borrowing history from other accounts to create your mythology.
Another issue that's hard to prove his historicity is the fact that Yeshua was like an extremely common name back then. They have found so many tombs in the Middle East with the name Yeshua written on them, but it's like it was as common as John was back then.
So, guys, we were talking about Josephus for a couple of minutes. For those people in the chat and those listening and watching who aren't acquainted with Josephus, he's an important character. Derek, give us a couple of sentences about him.
Josephus was a Jew in the 1st century. This is the consensus view. I can get into fringe ideas about this guy. I don't want to go there. Just the consensus view. Jewish man who existed in the 1st century. He's a historian. He was once someone who fought on behalf of Israel against Rome, according to his own accounts, was captured by the Romans, taken in, if you will, and converts, so to speak, to the opposing side and becomes, according to the Jews, he was a traitor. He went to the Roman side. He adopted, or they adopted him, and he took on the Flavius name, Flavius Josephus. So he became a Roman, if you will, puppet boy, so to speak, for Titus and Vespasian. He prophesies, or if you will, has somehow in his story where he predicts that Vespasian will be the emperor prior to Vespasian's reign, and says, don't worry, you're going to be the one out of the 4 emperors that fought for the kingdom in Rome, if you will. And he sure enough did win. So they said, hey, he must be a prophet or something, brings him in, and he writes this history. And he documents the war that took place between Rome and the Jews in the 1st century with the destruction of Jerusalem. And he goes into a lot of detail. Some of the stuff's extremely gory, from the cannibalism and the eating of their own children and stuff to a lot of interesting things. But you'll notice he also borrows a lot from the Old Testament into his own history. So it's hard to know what's really fact and what's theological history from
another thing to remember is the propaganda. Writing that your enemies were eating children is a classic propaganda tool to rally hatred towards a specific group.
I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked, though, if they surrounded Jerusalem for 3.5 years or whatever the amount of time was.
I'm just saying, like, the really graphic, like, evil things that the opposing side did,
right,
that's certainly open to debate, because propaganda was a big thing.
That's true. Yeah, a lot of times the senators, if you will, in Rome would talk crap about the emperors, and we're like, are we sure that Nero did that? Are we sure? That happens a lot, so you got to be careful when you do that. Josephus is important, though, very important, and Christians actually have thought for many years that he was as well, because there is a passage regarding the topic we're discussing here. There's actually two passages that imply a historical Jesus or imply a Jesus. And the interesting thing about Dr. Robert M. Price, Dr. Carrier, and others who are in the mythicist camps, they're not making this stuff up to make mythicism true. When they look at these, there are historicists, people who believe Jesus existed, who have argued and disputed these passages in Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, all the different passages that Christians will go to and say, that proves Jesus existed. Tacitus talks about a man named Chrestus that appears to be leading a revolt. Does that sound like your Jesus? I mean, is he a rebel? Do you believe he, so you start having problems when you take these people. Plus, he may be just hearing what this may not be documented in any historical literature. He might be hearing what other Christians already believe about Jesus. There's no telling if this is actual basis in a real guy. But I say that to say mythicists often will find clear people that don't believe that Jesus didn't exist, or they believe he did, if you will. And they use that as evidence to show, look, I'm not alone in this. This isn't because I want him to not exist. I'm going to this guy, and this guy believes Jesus existed, and he agrees with me on this passage. This doesn't work in your argument. Josephus says something about if you could even call him a man, like glorifies Jesus like he's a divine being of a human. Do you really think that he thought that of Jesus? I very much doubt it. They say Eusebius probably interpolated that. So
there's also the issue of synchronizing stories. They could have been stories about different people synchronized into one focal character. Sure. And reason why we can talk about it like Jesus is because there are times where Jesus talks about peace and love, and there are other times where he has a really bad temper. So that could definitely open the possibility that they were different people's stories that were kind of merged into this one character.
Yeah, my favorite Jesus is the horsewhip Jesus. The whipping people Jesus. That's just me.
I actually asked that question
about what would Jesus do in this situation? Well, he'd flip a table and start whipping people.
Yeah, or call a woman a dog because he's a racist. Anyway, not many people consider that woman who was not an Israelite that he calls a dog. The dog, you're a dog, get away. And she says, well, even the dogs get the crumbs, master. It's like, oh my gosh, can you imagine?
Well, there's also Jesus destroying the fig tree because the fruit had ripened,
and it wasn't in the right season or something. Yeah. I can't remember. But,
how petty can you be?
I actually asked Dennis McDonald, the gentleman that I told you guys earlier that talked about the connection between the Odyssey and the Iliad and the New Testament Gospels. And I said, Mr. McDonald, if you don't mind me asking, I said, is there a connection to possibly Jesus not being historical in cleansing the temple? I know Judah the Galilean in Josephus, the historian documents, that him and his father, I believe, somewhere around 0 AD, 4 BC, something like this, him and his father went and cleansed the temple in Jerusalem, and they got in big trouble for it. In fact, in one of the gospel narratives, that's the reason Jesus gets crucified. Of course, not all the synoptics even agree for how he freaking got killed and why. They can't even agree on that. But anyway, and this, I would never be saying this as a Christian. Like, you guys, I never, ever thought about this crap. For a Christian listening, you might go, what the, if they even turned here? I doubt they'll probably catch fire even turning the show on. But when I started reading this, I said, okay, you look at the Odyssey, Odysseus comes back to his house. All these men are trying to pimp his wife. They want to take his wife, and his son's in there going, get out of my house. You're screwing this house up. You're destroying my home. And what does Odysseus do? He comes home and they're all drunk one night and they pull the bow, Odysseus' bow. And they're like, hey, man, are you strong enough? And sure enough, the begging poor man, so to speak, says, yeah, I can do it. And he does it like it's nothing. Yeah. And who are you? They know something's not right. If this guy can do it, no one could but him. He says, it's me. Don't you recognize? It's Odysseus. And he cleanses his house. You have made my father's house into a den of thieves. So Jesus does the same thing. And I said, is this a literary construction, a fiction? Or is this based on the historical realization of Judas the Galilean? Do you see the conflict in my mind? It's easy to go, during the first century, There were real Jews who tried to cleanse the temple. There's also the Odyssey story where Odysseus comes to cleanse his home. And the son says, my father's house is turning into a den of thieves, so to speak. They're trying to steal my wife. They're trying to steal my home. They're taking all my goods. They're eating all my food, drinking all my wine. Is it one or the other or both? Was there really a guy who did cleanse the temple other than Judas the Galilean? I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I know for a fact, but I have good reasons to doubt.
Yeah. So, lads, we're getting to the end of our hour together. I know it's been a fast 60 minutes, fast and fun, dare I say. We're going to start off with our guest, Mr. Stephen DeMarco from Atheist News. I'm sorry, I keep wanting to say that. I don't know why, but what do you have going on your channel coming up? What's going on?
Well, I just started my year 4 in review today. So this morning I posted my top 10 weirdest stories of the past year. And it's going to continue every day for a little over a week until my next episode of Atheist News, which is the following weekend. So like tomorrow I'm posting my top 10 positive stories of the year. I'm doing top 10 worst stories. I'm doing top 5 winners, top 5 losers. I'm doing top 10 science stories from the past year. I'm doing Atheist Jeopardy moments of the past year. I'm doing kind of like a montage of all the other shows I produced in the past year, like Atheist Adventure in Nigeria, and how Nigeria is an interesting country and that it's the 7th most populated country in the world. However, they don't have a dominant religion. They are 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. How do they get along, you know?
Poorly. That's what, from what I understand, poorly.
And what's interesting about Nigeria's history is that at one time they had a dominant kingdom that was non-violent. If you committed violence in their borders, you were thrown out. So Nigeria has an interesting pre-colonialism group of religions that were in that area. But anyway, so yeah, I've got a lot of content. Normally I just do one video every weekend. But for this year-end in review, I go all out, and that's about it.
Cool. How about you, Derek?
First, I want to say thank you for having me join. I hope to join you again in the future. And everybody watching, hit that like button. It helps anyone you watch. As a as a guy who does his own YouTube channel and content creator, it helps grow the channels you want to see more content from. The bigger this channel can grow, the more this content can come to you guys. And so I really do appreciate Chris and Andy, and of course, Atheist Inc. Everybody on here, really thank you for joining me. I want to just mention, I just did a show, and I want you guys to kind of understand why I'm interested in this stuff. I just did a show with a guy named David Oliver Smith, who has a theory that Paul believed in a crucified Jesus, but his opponents that are trying to make everybody who he's teaching become circumcised did not. They had a different Jesus. What? A different Jesus? Well, he says, if you believe in circumcision, you don't believe in the Christ that was crucified. And he goes to make this argument. They didn't even have the same Jesus. In fact, they had a different gospel, a different Jesus. How can you have different Jesus? This is the guy lived 20, 30 years ago. So very hard for me to wrap my head around. If he's right, they could have a different weird angelic figure or a divine being that they're worshiping or following or listening to. Who knows? So I constantly ask this question. I'm going to expand out. I'm going to be having people on at some point on, did Buddha exist? I'm going to talk about different topics and expand. Myth is larger than just the Bible, and I'm just now realizing that. So thank you guys for letting me join.
Fantastic. Mr. Funk, what are you bringing in?
So recently I interviewed David Fitzgerald. We went through his book, Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. It was a pretty good conversation. I recently debated Kent Hovind. You can see that on my channel, Atheist Incorporated. I recently talked with a woman who survived an Amish cult, and it was a horrible experience she had. She managed to get out, so that's a good interview. And tomorrow, I will be talking with Dr. John Y., who is an expert on evolution. We're going to talk about Darwin and the history of evolutionary theory, misconceptions about Darwin, and Alfred Russel Wallace, and everything like that. So I should have that out here in just a couple days. That's what I've got going on.
Fantastic. I have someone from Extinction Rebellion coming on my show, hopefully on Thursday, which is tomorrow. And of course, on Friday, I'll have one of my rogues from my comedian friends coming on, and we're just going to talk about comedy stuff and have a good time.
Cool.
Yeah. So, Chris Mallett, are you here with us, sir?
You can hear me. They can't hear me. I had it separated. Anyway, thank you to everybody. Now it all works. I had it separated. Thank you to everybody. I just can't do 5 people at once. And this morning was my problem. So it's either me or those people. So thank you to all my guest hosts, Andy Hall, John Funk. I'm surprised I remembered all that stuff this morning. Weren't you guys proud of me? I did the intro. I didn't forget anybody. I didn't forget their names or where they're from or my name. It went well. I thought we had a good show. So thank you all. Thanks to my guest hosts and my guests for joining me. Remember to go and like and subscribe to their channel. Thank you to everybody in the damnation for watching, the people over in YouTube chat, the people on Facebook, and the people who listen on the Daily Atheist Morning Show podcast. I've had a lot of comments in the chat about getting Stephen DeMarco back on and Derek back on. They'd like to have actually both of them back on to talk about these very topics. Ooh, imagine getting Stephen, Derek, and Jason from Dragons and Genesis podcast. That would be a fantastic show. Anyway, all right, guys, I got to go. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you tomorrow. Take care. Thank you for watching the show. A special shout out to my gold level Patreon supporters, Ian Davenport, Cindy Plaza, and tons of mice. Thank you, and have a great day.